The elusive man famously labored under the illusion, no pun intended, that he had been a free agent, that he was acting out his own will for the sake of humankind, for the sake of Cerberus. But as it turned out, he had been indoctrinated by the Reapers, and he had always been their pawn. And in a similar way, human beings, under the current circumstances, often forget that freedom is largely an illusion. And questions of freedom are really questions about degrees of freedom. I mean this in an existential political sense, not necessarily a metaphysical sense. That's a separate discussion. But if we were to separate ourselves out from civilization and society, the only freedom you have is the freedom of death. You have to fight for your survival, so you have to make decisions and choices, and you have to be smart about that. And in the context of a modern civilization, we have a lot of useful myths and interesting mythology that we've cooked up to perpetuate the superstructure that we call society and civilization. Notions of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of action within limits, and therein lies the rub. And we have this big, gigantic pretense of democracy. Democracy is everyone's favorite buzzword. Democratic values, whatever that even means. It's never well defined, almost never. But we're all supposed to believe in it. And what the previous year and this year is showing us is something, frankly speaking, that we should always be hyper cognizant of. Namely, that freedom is an illusion. Not that you can take your freedom, it just doesn't exist in any conventional sense. And as long as we accede to being participants in a civilization, a society, we make concessions on our relative freedom. Once again, degrees of freedom. And what's interesting about the way the West has operated under the current circumstances is that much of what it's done has run counter to the will of the people, which is to say counter to so-called democratic principles. Now, once again, I'm not terribly sure what democratic principles mean, because it's just a buzz phrase. But kratos is power in Greek, and demos is the people. So it's the power of the people affecting the will of the people. And a lot of people, to be perfectly honest, are up in arms about the lockdowns and the state of affairs we find ourselves in. And it doesn't seem to matter very much. Freedom is all relative. But the really interesting thing you have to observe now, as we have transitioned into 2021 from the previous horrid year, is that we are kind of standing on a precipice, the current moment, between the delusions and illusions that have been promulgated for decades about freedom and democracy, and transitional period where all of that effectively sinks in the sand because the circumstances and exigencies are forcing governments, whether you agree with them or not, to take actions that would be, at least under the guise of democratic principles, very, very much frowned upon. Now, of course, none of this is really an issue for autocratic states like China. And arguably, although South Korea these days is not an autocracy, well, it certainly was back in the 80s and earlier times, not nearly as difficult because of cultural collectivist values and simply a different geist that they have compared to the West. So in the East Asian countries, they can affect these lockdowns much more readily, much more effectively. In fact, I have a friend who lives in South Korea who had gone to some kind of gathering, and it turned out through contact tracing that one individual at this gathering had been infected with the pestilence. And so all the people who had attended this gathering were forced into self-isolation as a consequence. Funded by the government, of course, and of course insisted upon by the government, the South Korean government. Now in these societies, whether it's the autocratic state of China or the highly collectivist state of South Korea, it just doesn't matter very much. But when you've spent decades lauding and praising to the heavens the values of democracy and the values of freedom and the values of this and that, and then turn your back on it in a very public way, the way a lot of politicians have, and I say this independent of whether or not I agree with the decisions they're making, then you run a real risk. And in that sense, we are, in fact, teetering on a precipice between an illusion that people had clung to for the longest period of time and something that is far more dire. Because you really have to think. The current pestilence is not the deadliest pestilence in the history of mankind. There have been far, far worse. So what would happen, given the current measures put in place, if another pestilence were to emerge? And let's be honest, it's very, very possible. The last few decades really were a lucky streak at best. We got through them more or less unscathed, but we got through them unscathed because they were anomalous when you look at the greater backdrop of history. But imagine an even worse pestilence emerges on the horizon. What measures do you think will be implemented then? House arrest? Permanent house arrest? Who knows? And I think in such a case, governments will have to kiss goodbye to their claims of democracy and freedom and blah, blah, blah. Because we're already kind of long past that in many respects. But that might be the final tipping point. Because ultimately all forms of freedom are an illusion. And the worst of these illusions is the illusion that we collectively tell ourselves that our societies are free societies. Relative to what? And more importantly, given the situation we find ourselves in, relative to which circumstances? Freedom is both elusive and elusive. And the problem with moving past a tipping point is that it's really hard to go back. It's essentially akin to the famous quandary of the toothpaste escaping the tube. Once the toothpaste is out of the tube, it is very difficult to get back in there. And so, at the very least, many of the measures that have been taken since implemented in our countries will be probably nigh permanent. I think we will find ourselves in a situation not all too different from 9/11, where in the wake of it, and subsequently, for every year thereafter, we'd experience a different form of travel, especially international travel. Things had changed. Protocol, procedure had changed. And I think likewise, in light of this plague, things will change permanently as well. And so what we will return to eventually will not be what we once had. It never is. The past is the past. It's irretrievable. We can only move forward. At best, it'll be a verisimilitude of what used to be. Some things will return, but many things won't. And we will, as they say, get used to it until the next crisis crops up and the next cycle of changes takes place. So lest we lament the loss of our freedom, let us be wise enough to recognize we never had any freedom in the first place. Anyway, please like the video, hit the share button, hit the bell icon to be informed of forthcoming videos. And as always, may the gods watch over you. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. Take care of yourselves. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.